Hi all, in this video we're going to be looking at Canada as a destination to pursue higher education in the field of management. It could be for an MBA, it could be for an MIM or MS in management, or it could be for the newbie in the block, which is data analytics. Right? Canada is now actually becoming a favorite destination for a lot of Indian students. Why? One, unlike US, the immigration policies in Canada are a lot more favorable, be it for a student visa, be it to get work permit, be it to convert it into the equivalent of green card, which is PR in Canada. Right? Second, Canada has got a handful of very good business schools, some things which have international repute. Third, the job market in Canada is also equally favorable, which makes it a good proposition to pursue an MBA or any field of management higher education in Canada. What are we going to do? In this video, we're going to be looking at the following aspects. First, we're going to look at what are the top business schools that you should do an MBA from or a management education in Canada. Second, we're going to look at what is the average GMAT score that a typical Indian IT male with 3+ years of experience should have to get an admit there. Are there scholarships available in Canada akin to the way we find it in the US? And if so, do you get 100% scholarship or only part tuition fee waivers? If it's a part tuition fee waiver, how do you fund the balance? Do you need to have collateral in India? Do you need to find a co-guarantor or a co-signer in the Canada? Right? All of these are answered. Subsequently, done an MBA. The obvious next question that we're going to ask is, how is the job market? What is the average starting salary that one gets? And after getting a job, how do I convert it? How do I hold on to staying in that country? Is a work permit is tied to the student, to the aspirant, or is it tied to an employer the way it is in H1B in the US? And finally, how easy or difficult is it to convert it into a permanent residency? How long do you have to wait to become a permanent resident of Canada post doing an MBA in Canada? Do you do a 1-year MBA? Do you do a 2-year MBA? Which schools are good for 1-year MBA? Which schools are good for 2-year MBA? Lastly, many of us think that the route to US is through Canada. How feasible it is? All of these I have not answered. The way we have gone about it is, I caught up with one of our alum. Mr. Arun Ganesh is an alumnus of Wizako. He did his MBA from Rotman Business School of University of Toronto, by far the #1 business school in Canada. He's working for the financial sector here. I've done a Skype conversation with him. The video that follows is basically a 20-minute Skype conversation with Arun Ganesh, where the horse, you hear it from the horse's mouth. He basically is going to narrate you through all these opportunities in Canada, and he's also going to walk you through his story. So for a lot of you, that could be an inspiration, right? Stay tuned in. Going to be switching to the Skype interview.
Hi Arun, good evening. It should be quite late in Toronto right now. It's about 9 o'clock in the morning in India.
Good evening, Bhaskar. Thank you. This is good morning, Bhaskar. Sorry, I'm conditioned that way. Yeah, it's about 11:20, but no worries.
Thank you. Thanks for staying late. As I mentioned in our earlier call and the mail, we'd like to do a quick session on applying to Canadian business schools, the prospects, getting an understanding about the lay of the land. And We'll round it up with your story, because while a lot of other things that you're going to be sharing are very valuable, what usually fascinates me are the stories that people have, as in their paths. There's a lot that one could relate to and learn from those. So we'll keep the juicier part, that part to the end. We'll start with the more objective questions right away. Just wanted to get your flavor on what are the top business schools in Canada. Does Canada have the number of business schools that US has got? For example, in the US, top 50 is a number we'll probably stop to take a breath saying that I'll stop applying at this point. Canada, I'm sure, does not have so many schools. What are the good schools? Are there any regional flavors that one should consider when one is applying to Canadian schools? So you can give a lay of the land. That'll be very useful for us.
Sure, Bhaskar. Like you rightly pointed out, see that essentially is a function of the economy, the GDP size, right? So Canada is a much smaller economy and much smaller number of people, and the economy as such is kind of dependent on primarily, I would say, two sectors. One is financial services, the other is natural resources. So, and these two markets are essentially concentrated in and around Toronto, and on the natural resources side, a little bit of Calgary and Vancouver. There's a small market, I would say, on the Montreal as well compared to Toronto. So the business schools are essentially concentrated in these regions. So if you take the Toronto region, there is Rotman School of Business that is essentially attached to the University of Toronto. Then again, there's one more in Toronto by the name Schulich School of Business that's attached to the York University. And on the suburbs of Toronto, in a suburb called Hamilton, there is a university called McMaster University, and they have a business school attached to them. All these three programs are 2-year programs. So a little bit away from Toronto, 3 hours to the west, is a place called London, Ontario, very similar to London, England. There is a university called University of Western Ontario, which has the Richard Ivey School of Business. It's a 1-year program, and it's also well reputed here in Canada. On the eastern side, in a place called Kingston, attached to the Queen's University, there is again a 1-year program. Again, well reputed in Canada and closer to the Toronto job market.
Right.
There is a business school in Montreal attached to the McGill University, and there is a business school attached to the University of British Columbia, and I don't have much information on that. So these are, I would say, so well reputed or known names in Canada. And of course, I went to Rotman, which is attached to the University of Toronto, which is in downtown Toronto. And I believe that's the top notch program here in Canada.
Absolutely, absolutely. So we're talking about 6, 7 programs, about 4 of those 2-year programs and a couple of them 1-year programs.
Right. Yeah. That's what it is. And all these schools, they also offer a part-time variation that's probably targeted for working folks here. And from an international student perspective, it is for probably primary, permanent residents of Canada who are already working here, or Canadian citizens.
Super. So a primary focus is the full-time program from these 5-6 places that you had mentioned.
Right.
I'll come to a few more questions, but the top-notch question that many students have before they apply, however much there are other factors that come into play. GMAT is one factor which is still in their control. A lot of their profile is already in the past, right? GMAT is something that they can work towards, they can improve, they can do things
That's
about
true.
it.
Yeah, right.
So the rhetorical question, what is an average or what is a good GMAT score for an Indian to apply to these programs? And what is a score to apply to get a scholarship from these programs? And do they offer scholarships at all?
Right. So, so I'm going to give you a very cliched but very honest answer. It depends. So,
Right.
and there is a reason to it. And of course, I'll get to the specifics for sure. And there's a reason to it. So all these business schools, in essence, they're competing against the global market as well as in the Canadian market. So they would obviously, one of the criteria these ranking systems or ranking agencies use is the average GMAT score of the student. So every school would like to have would like to give importance to GMAT as such. So, and that's what I believe too as well. So there's no average per se. I mean, of course, the average it keeps floating over the year, and all those historic data is definitely available on the university, on the different schools' website. But in my opinion, I would say anything north of 730 should, along with some good essays, should definitely get the interviewers or the admission office's attention, because I believe from that you have essentially communicated through your score that you are good at math, you're good at reading and data interpretation and stuff like that. So yeah, I believe that's a good score. Then going to the scholarship, right? So I know in the US that it's not common, but I have heard that people get like full tuition fee waivers and all that, which is kind of unheard of in Canada. So, but having said that, I have seen folks in my own classmates in my own cohort get up to 40-45% of their tuition fee waived because of their profiles, because of their application, because of their interview, and of course their GMAT score. So, and one thing I can definitely say is all these guys who got like very good scholarships had very good GMAT scores, north of 750 plus. So That I can definitely say.
Super, super. So let's say someone gets a 40% tuition fee waived. We're looking
Right.
at that scenario.
Right.
What would a 2-year program cost in, let's say, Canadian dollars, and let's look at the Indian rupee equivalent so that people get an idea about what they are up against in terms of a financial resource that they should be planning in 2019 terms, because that's what we can basically talk about. Give or take a 10% here, there is obviously fine, but a ballpark number.
Okay, so I'm not aware of the exact 2019 numbers, but of course I believe, given that the inflation numbers here in Canada are around 2.5%, the numbers wouldn't have changed dramatically. That's my assumption. So I think it was about $110,000 of Canadian dollars for a 2-year program in Rotman. And from my understanding, the 1-year programs are around 65 to 70% of that amount. So if one person gets, let's say, 40% ride on 110,000, so he's essentially getting about 44,000 Canadian dollars, which means he owes 66,000 Canadian dollars for a 2-year term, which approximately is about, in today's exchange rate, is about 33-35 lakhs. One good, I mean, of course, we can debate about the pros and cons of a 1-year versus 2-year MBA, and both have pros and cons depending on what the person is looking for. One thing is that in a 2-year MBA is that you definitely get these internships, or some schools call it co-ops here, some schools call it internships. So these internships are very valuable. One, because most students convert their internship to a full-time position after they land
Fabulous.
an MBA, and it obviously pays them, which is good enough for managing their living expenses, and perhaps use a small amount of it to pay their tuition fee for the upcoming year. So that's also pretty common that folks do.
Right. And as a rejoinder to that question, so how does one fund, how does one bridge that 35-40 lakhs that in Indian rupee terms are about 70,000 Canadian dollars? Does one borrow in India, or do students typically borrow in Canada? Is the Canadian school financial system well-oiled that they arrange for no co-guarantor, no collateral loan? Do such things exist in Canada?
I mean, it used to exist, but my recent understanding is that I'm talking about the last part where you're talking about no guarantor loans.
Right.
I believe have kind of dwindled down because of for a lot of reasons. But what many people do is they get co-signers or guarantors who are based out through a friend, a relative, or a family member who already lives here. So
Right.
that way they get a pretty good competitive rate, and there are banks who are willing to lend at prime rate, which is about 4.5% for a Canadian. I think 4.5 or 5%, and in the current interest rate scenario, that's a pretty good interest rate. So I believe, I was told, I'm not sure about it, because when I graduated, or when I got into the business school, this no cosigner did exist, and that's how I was able to fund the non-scholarship part of my MBA.
Right.
I'm told that so they have tie-ups with Indian banks, and ICICI Bank has some operations here in Canada. I think through some kind of a guarantee or anything like that. The Canadian, ICICI Bank or any other bank needs to give a guarantee to a Canadian bank, and the Canadian bank essentially funds these loans. And these loans, the good thing about these loans is most of it is structured in most banks in such a way that you don't need to pay the principal amount starting forward. You just need to service the interest in the 2 year, plus they give you a 6 months of grace period after you graduate. So that gives you about 2.5 year of runway to just service the interest component, and after that you start paying the principal and interest component, and it's for, I believe, about the total tenor of about 8 or 10 years. So that essentially takes care of, that's how I've seen most international students fund their MBAs. Of course, the first option would be to dip into personal savings, depending on how much you would have.
Super, super, super. Next thing, we have borrowed, we have found money to study. How are the job prospects? What sectors are the leading sectors that recruit? And again, this number, I want to get a flavor of the number, not because it varies substantially. What would be a typical average starting salary for an Indian with 3 to 5 years experience who goes to one of these Canadian schools?
Okay. So again, it again comes back to the economy and also the benefits that one does get from a Canada, and it is and in from an international market perspective, and most students do, and I did that too. So I wouldn't say that a mistake as such, but most people do this. So the US is a very, very capitalistic society. So the work benefits and all that is very different from what you get from a Canadian system, which is, I wouldn't say completely socialistic, but it is somewhere, I would say, I don't know if it's a fine balance, but I would like to believe so, that it's a balance between a capitalistic society and a socialistic society where you get some benefits, or your employers are mandated to give certain benefits. So for that reason, the average starting salary from a Canadian business school perspective is much lower, and that is where actually a lot of Canadian business school lose out to a US business school on a ranking system. I would say the base salary that one could expect would be, it's again, I would say, I'm sure most GMAT participants would know, it's like a Lombard distribution, but the average or the median is somewhere around 85 to $90,000 on a base, and you can expect about 10% of bonus as on your first year. So that's typically what it is.
Okay. But there are welfare benefits, which would probably include medical, a lot of other things that
exactly, because here the state is mandated to give you the medical benefits. So for example, compared to the US, where your employer, if you are an H1B, your employer gives you medical benefits. Here your employer gives you a top up over what the state already provides you.
Right.
So that way it has to all of it has to come from the tax salaries. So you would find that compared to, of course, if you take New York and California out of the picture, compared to the US tax system, Canadian taxes are slightly higher as well. But if you bring New York and California in the equation, it's almost the same.
So what sectors typically recruit? As in
I missed that. Thanks for getting back. So Canadian economy, as I mentioned, is a much smaller economy, dependent on primarily two sectors: financial services and natural resources. So you would see that all jobs that are currently there are kind of revolving around that. But having said that, especially in this environment, we see a lot of these startups in multiple sectors, in the tech sector, in the e-commerce sector, also recruiting, and these big names like Amazon, Facebook, Google also exist in Canada, and they're able to leverage the local talent. So those are the biggest. I would say those are the biggest recruiters in the Canadian business schools.
So if I can
and of course
summarize,
so
it would be financial services,
financial services, natural resources, tech, and of course consulting, because you always need consultants to go to for all these three sectors. So from recruiting perspective, for somebody who's looking for a job right after an MBA, you could end up in financial services, consulting, e-commerce, startups, depending on your interest.
Super. Do people shift function area? For example, I would have worked for 5 years in an IT major like Infosys or TCS in India, do a Rotman MBA and go into a financial sector job. Has that happened?
Oh, definitely. So yes, does that happen? But the one cannot definitely leverage upon their past experience, because I wouldn't say it is irrelevant because that person would have gained something of that 5 years, but you kind of are restarting your career, so you should be, expecting to do that. It's a restart of your career, so you are starting again from the bottom of the ladder in terms of the organizational hierarchy. So that does happen, and one has to network a lot to, get get wherever they wanted and have like a very good story that tells as to why they want to change. And I have seen a lot of them do it, of course, depending on how motivated they are. Another trend that I have seen since you mentioned this IT is technology is a focus here in Canada, especially because there's a lot of technology, projects that are happening, and most folks who have a technology background are able to leverage upon their technological expertise and kind of get into more senior roles in technology, in the financial services, natural resources, e-commerce, those spaces as well. So that's also something that I have seen a lot of folks do.
Okay, so if one is keen on continuing with a tech function, can go to a different industry and leverage the past experiences and actually start off at not at the bottom of the ladder.
Right. And another thing that I have observed in Canada is, I can definitely say because I have worked in India for a few years, and here in the Canadian, market, or it is generally well encouraged for, if there is, let's say, a job that is coming up, they generally encourage internal candidates, and
Okay.
even the, even your superiors and managers, if you have put in your different experience and you are found as a very valuable resource to the company, they encourage movement. So I have seen some movement across, somebody who is in technology not make a dramatic shift, but somewhat a related shift in the business area. So that is also something that is common here in the Canadian job market.
That's wonderful. That's wonderful. Next comes, right, the equivalent in US H1B is a lottery. And then from there to get a green card is like, is anybody's guess. What is the system in Canada? I think PR is a lot easier to come one's way if you're in Canada compared to how things are in the US, permanent residency.
Yes, and that is why actually a lot of folks pick Canadian business schools, because there are multiple advantages in that stream. So the first I would say is that when you're doing a 1 year program in Canada, you are offered, after you graduate, you're offered a 1 year work permit. And if you do a 2 year program in Canada, you're offered a 3 year work permit after your MBA.
So, just a minute. It is not linked to an employer, right? It's like
it is not linked to an employer.
Arun is given a permit. It's not processed through a company.
Irrespective of whether Arun has a job offer or not has a job offer, he's still looking for a job, gets a work permit. And
super.
And most Canadian, so since this system is there, Canadian employers don't sponsor a work permit, and they don't need to because you're already having a work permit. So which is good. And the next path is obviously the you have a job, you have a work permit, and the next thing would be to logical step would be, okay, can I maintain the status? Yes, you can. What you can do is then you can look at, applying for a permanent residency. Of course, but that's a different story about altogether by itself. But a related thing I would say is there is in the permanent residency, multiple routes that you can get permanent residency in Canada. One of them is called Canadian Experience Class. So, which is what most MBAs or my own cohort, including myself, got the permanent residency is through the Canadian Experience Class. So you have 1 year or 12 months of full-time experience here in Canada. You are able to apply your Canadian permanent residency, and you kind of secure your status that way.
Okay, and what is the wait period? As in, to get an idea again, it might change as it stands today. Typically, the wait in the US is like anywhere about 10 years or more, right, to get a green card.
So, the official time that is per the the government website, I think is 6 months. Right. But most folks get it in 3 to 4 months after they apply for a permanent residency if they meet the criteria.
Wonderful, wonderful, wonderful.
I started off with the first benefit. The second benefit is most folks, if in case they are married,
Mm,
so while they are studying here,
mm,
they can bring their spouses along, which you
mhm.
can do in US as well.
Right.
The advantage is that the spouse does
Mm.
get a work permit the day the spouse lands.
Wow.
So, as dependent of the student,
Mm,
the spouse is given a work permit,
mm,
and most folks, if they enter a 2 year MBA program, some of the
mm.
folks who enter a 2 year program with their spouses, what happens is typically both of them come in, and the husband or the wife starts the MBA program, and the
Mm,
spouse
mm,
starts looking for a job opportunity. They get a job,
mm,
and by the time this husband or wife finishes the MBA program,
mm.
the spouse has already has a 1 year work permit, and they've
Right.
already finished the 1 year Canadian experience class, and they apply for a permanent residency.
Okay. Okay. So by the time the person completes the MBA, thanks to the spouse, he or she would have a permanent residentship.
And of course, taking care of the living expenses because the spouse is essentially earning.
So you recommend guys to get married before they hit Canada.
And girls, definitely.
Right. How easy or otherwise is it to look for a job in the US with a Canadian MBA?
Okay, that's that. Okay, I've been asked this question before. It's kind of unheard of.
Hmm,
So if you unless you have a US work permit, so
hmm.
you finish the Canadian MBA. I'm again talking purely from an Indian perspective. A
Right.
person who's never worked in India. I mean, who's never worked in the US, doesn't have an US work permit.
Hmm.
It's kind of hard to get to justify to an employer in the US with a Canadian degree as to why you're going to work. So you're essentially joining the same H1B queue for multiple reasons. So that's kind of unheard of.
Super, super, super. So
But
one
having
shouldn't
said
think that
that, there's
Canada is
an
a path to US.
right. But again, what again things happen is, I mean, if you have patience in life, anything good and you're doing the right efforts always happens, right? So like
Hmm,
that, what I this again something that I have heard and I've seen some of the folks do. Once they come, they finish their Canadian experience, they get the PR, they get the citizenship, and then some folks do try for depending on the sector that they work for, they do try for employment opportunities in the US. They're definitely more successful that way compared to sitting in India and trying.
super, super, super. Lastly, your story. What were you doing? And you could possibly quickly run through your college, post-college, pre-MBA experience and like why, how things that probably you would have done differently given an option. If you can share it for a couple of minutes, that'll be wonderful.
Sure. So my story is atypical compared to typical. I mean, from my own Indian classmates, but I mean, I see that a lot happening right now. So I am. I mean, like most folks, I finished an engineering degree, then tried to figure out what I wanted to do in my life.
Mm,
Worked for software engineer with Infosys for 2 years, and then I went to I cracked CAT. I went on to do my PGDIM from NITI Bombay.
mm,
After that, I worked for about 4 years in corporate banking and sales and trading.
mm,
Having worked in the Indian finance industry, I was kind of curious to kind of explore and get exposure across the world.
mm.
And you would have guessed by now that I was married when I wanted to
Mhm.
move here.
Right.
So it definitely helped.
Mm,
And my wife, I definitely wanted my wife to help. We did have a lot of family in the US, but the US, the problem was, again, I didn't want to go through the same H1B route and wait for my wife not working and all that. And it's
mm.
definitely a burden financially as well. So,
Right.
so I kind of considered Canada, and having worked in the derivatives space, Rotman was a well-reputed school in that space. It's very well known for finance.
Mm,
So I picked Rotman, and they gave me a decent scholarship as well.
mm,
So yeah, that was what I did. I had a really good experience at Rotman. I mean, the class it was a class of 350, very very well diverse. In my own group, I had some amazing friends who one represented Canada in the Olympics. One
Wow.
was an English teacher from Hong Kong. So coming from a very typical analytical background, I mean, it was kind of an eye opener for me, because until then in life I'd always heard of very unidirectional views. This kind of opened me up, and the faculty that I would say is probably world class. We had some really really great faculty with amazing pedigree and amazing research capabilities. So, and some of them have taught in like the top business schools in the US, like the top 2 or 3 business schools in the US. And Rotman was very keen that they have the best quality of talent on the teaching side, and it's even across the US business school. I mean, across the North American business school, I would say that they consistently score high on the research and teaching capabilities.
Super.
So that's why I picked Rotman, and I definitely had a great experience there. I was able to achieve what I came to do for.
Canada.
So that why I came to Canada. So I was able to achieve that. Of course, there's a lot of networking involved. There's a lot of there are, I mean, you would go through some really grueling times, which is what you're expected to do in an MBA. Because if you're taking it easy, then you're doing something wrong, at least in an MBA. And of course, you're putting a lot of money for that.
Right.
So what could I have done differently? Uh, so yeah, probably in the first couple of months, I mean, coming especially somebody who's not been in a classroom setting and not used to exams and that kind of stuff for about 5 or 6 years before I actually came into my first ever exam. I could have taken it more seriously. In fact, first couple of exams that I wrote, I couldn't even finish 70% of the paper because I was very slow in writing. Of course, every person is for himself. So I could have been more serious and kind of focused more. But in the end, I did figure out a way, kind of worked out for me. So that's essentially my story. Not sure if you want me to concentrate on any other aspect. Happy to share any thoughts that I have in that.
You had admits from 2 schools when you chose Rotman. You had an admit from Queen too, right?
Right,
Or
you're
McGill.
right. So sorry, Queens. Yeah, I had admit from Queens, which was a 1 year program. I was at a 2 year program, and again, I was debating in my mind between a 1 year and 2 year, because I already have an MBA,
Right.
or I wouldn't say an MBA, PGDIM. So yeah, so I already had that from India, and so I was kind of debating about 1 year versus 2 year. I did some research. I mean, I spoke to a few folks, and I mean, Queens is a definitely great program, and I have a lot of friends from that program. But I chose Rotman over Queens primarily for the reason that it is in downtown Toronto, where I could network, and I wanted to go back to the financial services space. I kind of had decided by then that that's where my calling is, and that's what I wanted to do for the rest of my life. So yeah, so having said that, Toronto is the financial capital of Canada. It is, I think, in the world, it's like the 7th largest financial hub or something like that. So downtown Toronto, and Rotman is known for its finance faculty. We have some amazing finance faculty here at Rotman. So and I got that's the feedback I got, and therefore I know it was still a 2 year program, but like I took the plunge and it paid off.
Turned out great.
Hopefully.
It is. It is. Thank you so much. Thank you so much. Is there anything else that you think that needs to be added in this? Or probably some folks after watching this might post their questions and comments. I'll forward it to you. I'll take your response and give it back to them. So that's something I'll probably fall back and take your help from.
Oh, definitely. So I'm happy to pay it forward. I definitely got some inputs from folks when I was in that zone. So
Right.
I'm happy to pay it forward.
Thank you so much. It's quite late now and you have a working day tomorrow. I'll sync with you on a different note, on a personal note later.
Okay, good luck, folks. Definitely, if you're considering an MBA in the developed world, Canada is definitely one of the options that you should consider. Given the the especially the on the immigration angle, and of course the economy, and you would definitely get a very good experience if you put in the right efforts and do the right things. So good luck with your GMAT journey.
Thank you.